we had dinner with Doug Tallamy tonight and his lovely wife Cindy, and I said to Doug, I have the honor of introducing you tonight. What would you like me to say among your long list of accomplishments and books and etc.? And he said, just say, here's Doug. If you want to know more, look it up.
Well, thank you. That's the best introduction I've ever had. We've got important things to talk about, and my bio is not one of them. So, yeah, let's talk about what my idea of nature's best hope is. And I'll give you a spoiler. You're nature's best hope. You knew that. So I'm really going to talk to you about why I think you're nature's best hope. But before we do that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. Am I standing right in your way? I bet. No? You can see? I feel like I'm in your way. The late E.O. Wilson. He died the day after Christmas 2 years ago. Extremely long, productive career at Harvard. And one thing that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on planet Earth. He had a lot to do with the term biodiversity that we all use today. And throughout his career, he wanted to save life on planet Earth. Not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature, we're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it will disappear everywhere. And that includes humans, by the way. Very, very bold message. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that bold message. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's good news. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and everything that's in trouble can be in that half, and we'll be in the other half, and it'll be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. I don't see that diminishing much in the near future. And we've got 8 billion people. Actually, I learned the other day, 8.1 billion people. And all of our hardscape and roadways and detritus and airports in the other half. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? That's really what I want to talk about tonight, and I think we can, but we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened in 2019 on the East Coast, and then again this year in many parts of the country. We had a very large oak mast. Members, particularly of the red oak group, got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time, and this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, chew a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, and after it's out of the acorn, it's a dangerous time for that insect because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses, because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and their mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? I want to think about the very next year the way most insects would. Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, once they leave the acorn, there's a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants. Tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole and a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move the colony, grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. And then once they're inside, they post a guard here and make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they live for the next 2 years until that acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile, some people say a mile and a half from the parent tree. They tap the acorn beneath the soil surface. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And they can bury, a single jay can bury up to 4,500 acorns every fall. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have a lot of pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Basilia, that plant. That is the only pollen that that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all night, all week, all year about nature specialized relationships. The point I want to make today is that these specialized relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave the lower 48 states as it was. There's only about 5% that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And those are mostly mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. Pennsylvania, when 1900, Pennsylvania was denuded and burned over. It was a disaster area. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres. Is it possible to get? Grazed it, 770 million acres of rangeland. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need. Because again, it is nature that keeps us alive on this planet. Edwin Way Teale decades ago said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's just common sense. It's just common sense. So why have we done this? I don't know. But I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some scary headlines pretty regularly these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. It's a third of our North American bird population, already gone. Now the UN's predicting that we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years, and they made that prediction 2 years ago. So now it's the next 18 years. It's a prediction. It has not happened yet. And we have to make very sure that it does not happen. These are the species that keep us alive on this planet. It is serious business. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that will take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if insects disappeared from planet Earth, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very simple. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. our amphibians, our birds, our reptiles, our mammals, they'd all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And again, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Now there is some good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. It's just a few things in the top group here that plants do every day, that we depend on every day, like produce oxygen, pretty important, clean our water, slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use, carbon capture, enormously important today, as you all know. Well, plants, it's one of the solutions we have out there. They're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of that carbon. And they don't stop there. Then they pump the extra carbon that they fix through photosynthesis into the ground through their root systems. And once it's in the ground, it is extremely stable. It can stay there thousands of years if we don't turn the ground over again. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, they're converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and then we will lose weight. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can. But we are in the 6th great extinction event the planet has ever experienced, so it's obviously not good enough. I think the solution is to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves, on landscapes just like that. And there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups who have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area and going to another area doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we were smart enough to learn how to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called a land ethic, and he wrote about it in his most famous book, The Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture. He may not have recognized it as an option. But what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, private property. Why private property? Because most of the land is privately owned. 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and failure is not an option. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. That has been our conservation model for the last 100 years, and we want to keep doing it. But it's not good enough. It's not good enough. So now we have to move beyond conservation into restoration, where we're actually rebuilding natural systems. We're putting it back together. And there are many people who would argue there's no way you can put it back exactly the way it was, and they're probably correct. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions that I opened the talk with to create ecosystem function once again, even if it's not exactly what was in a particular space at some point in the past. But in order for this to succeed, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most important groups. And there's two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun, and through photosynthesis, turning it into the food, the simple sugars and carbohydrates. The energy of the sun is now in the carbon bonds of the simple sugars and carbohydrates. That is the food that supports all the animals on the planet, with some minor exceptions of things at the bottom of the ocean. So now we have plants that have made the food. The food is locked up in plant parts, but mostly leaves. If we don't get that food to animals, we don't have any animals. And if we don't have any animals, we don't have any functional ecosystems. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate those plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insects. It turns out that caterpillars are enormously important. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That is the chickadee that is in Cindy and my backyard and front yard. Actually, they're in my front yard. That's where the feeder is. Up here, you got the black-capped chickadee. They're pretty much the same bird doing the same thing. They are the birds at our feeders all winter long, eating seeds. And we tend to think that's all they need is seeds. But it turns out that only 50% of their diet is seeds, even in the wintertime. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they give up seeds and they turn to invertebrates. And if they are in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. Why is that? What's special about caterpillars? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? Caterpillars are nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have really sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. And you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids, so we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? Well, from what they're, particularly during the breeding season, from what they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content of bird prey items is not equal. Those first two bars way over there are caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. The butterfly diagram there represents the adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. And it turns out there's a direct relationship between the frequency with which a prey item is brought back to the nest and its carotenoid content. Caterpillars are brought back more than anything else, and they have the highest carotenoid content, followed by orthopteroids, things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. And then everybody else with low carotenoid level is nested down there. So those studies and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Are 1 or 2 a day enough? That's a good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? 1 or 2 is not enough. 1 or 2 a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one nest of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count that. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one nest of a bird that is 1/3 of an ounce. 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And that is true for most of the birds out there. They're foraging very close to the nest. And if we don't have all those caterpillars in our yards, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al., that's the Smithsonian group, who said that we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years, and we divided up the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of the seeds that they eat, and that's what they can rear their young on. And look, that group didn't decline at all in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects declined on average 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. And it's not just little birds that like caterpillars. This is a kestrel eating a white-lined sphinx moth. And it's not just caterpillars, not just birds that like caterpillars. This is an ornate box turtle in the Midwest. They used to be common. They used to chase armyworm and cutworm populations around and eat hundreds of caterpillars a day. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do 2 things, be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. But that's not going to happen if we don't put the caterpillars back. So how do you put caterpillars into your landscape? Well, you put caterpillars there by putting the plants that support those caterpillars there. You put the plants in, the caterpillars will come. And it seems very straightforward, but there is a catch. And that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we put in our yards. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all of the calorie pear, all of the burning bush, all the barberry, all the ginkgos, all the hostas, all the privets, all the things we typically landscape with, all those non-native Asian plants in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly, is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization, and it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, plants have made them specialize. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction, so they've loaded their tissues with nasty-tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And if you don't believe me, when you're walking to your car, eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. The reason it's green in the summertime is because it's not that there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's that most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But insects do eat plants, so how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the plants for which they have specialized adaptations that allow them to get around those defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of interacting with the plant lineage for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas or any of the other plants that are not milkweeds, the monarch is not going to start eating your hostas. It's locked into eating milkweeds. So it has two choices in that case, and that is fly away and find milkweed someplace else, if there is someplace else, or starve to death. Turns out there's three kinds of plants out there. Plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks. We have 91 species of oaks in this country, and wherever they occur, they are delivering more energy to local food webs than any other plant genus by far. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant. Has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo. And that is true for so many of our ornamentals. So it's not adding any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be Callery pear, Bradford pear, or privet, or burning bush, or porcelain berry, or any of those invasives that not only do not add energy to the local food web, but they escape where we plant them and become serious invasives, covering literally hundreds of millions of acres in this country. So they're removing, and they're pushing out the native plants that provide the energy, and they're removing, in that sense, they're removing energy from the local food web. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We cannot restore ecosystems if we don't restore the food webs within those ecosystems, and that's not going to work unless we use the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when we do use the right plants, starting with our house where Cindy and I live. This is where we live in Oxford, Pennsylvania. It's what it looked like the year we moved in 2000. It was a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. The last thing, a very old farm, but farmed almost 300 years, and the last thing they did was mow it for hay. So very, very few plants there. And our job was to put it back together again, which we had never done. We really didn't know what we were doing. But one of the things I wanted to try was planting a plant, a known host plant of a particular caterpillar, and seeing whether that caterpillar actually came and used that plant on our property, seeing whether it colonized this wasteland. And the first one I tried was a Canadian owlet. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet before. And people say, why'd you choose a Canadian owlet? A lot of thought went into it. I was flipping through Dave Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America, and I said, that's a pretty one. That's what the adult looks like, just like the leaf. Well, you don't have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. That's their only host plant. I'm sure there was meadow rue there 300 years ago before the area was farmed to death, but the meadow rue is long gone. So I got some seeds from someplace. I planted them at home. They grew very nicely, but this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would appear out of nowhere and colonize my tiny patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. But then I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over, it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we've got 2 species on the property that we didn't have before. We got Canadian owlets and meadow rue. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. That beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Bidens aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Bidens aristosa, but I did know where there were some Bidens in a power line cut 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, brought them home, planted them. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over our front yard. That's okay. I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but they did, and now we have a good population of both of those, so we've added 4 species to the property. I wanted to see if the hackberry emperor would come and make a living at our house. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be on our property. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry trees, I planted them. Had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find our hackberry, but they did, and now we've got a good population of them. So we've added 6 species, and that is how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, it came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that require goldenrod. Like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcitra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparagidothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths in the mid-Atlantic states that use goldenrod, very important plant. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. We're talking at dinner tonight that some people don't like Virginia creeper. I I don't know why. Look, it's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. It makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they're high in fat. Our migrating birds need sources of fat to complete their migration, and our overwintering birds need sources of fat to get them through the winter. And those berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know when Virginia creeper is in bloom, and it's just ready to pop into bloom right now. Until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. It turns out it's an excellent pollinator plant. So remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the leonard sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent to make a living at our house, just because it's such a cool-looking caterpillar. Looks like a stegosaurus. I mean, really, if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. It's a special stone elm, particularly American elm, and of course we didn't have any American elm. Lost that to Dutch elm disease decades ago. But there are two big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die, and every year they make a lot of seed. So the second year after we moved in, I gathered up some of the seeds from the gutter. Native plant gardening does not have to be expensive. I planted them, they germinate in 6 days, they grow very quickly. Today those trees are over 80 feet tall, and I've got several of them at home. And yes, they brought in the double-toothed prominent, another big success, American elm. I want to see if we get the evening primrose moth to make a living at our house, because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, as its name suggests, it needs evening primrose, and we didn't have any. So I planted evening primrose. Moth did come, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's cute. No, it's always cute. Sometimes it's crowded in there. But yes, it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now these are just examples of the plants I put back on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can't enjoy your oak until it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, free, or 2-foot bare root webs, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to bring in the moths that create the caterpillars that run the food web at my house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned eucalyptrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that's just popped its head above the leaves, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. People say, oh no, he's going to kill the tree. No, another bird's going to come eat that in the next 20 minutes. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to support your local food web. It will do it the very first year. And that's what our house looks like pretty much today. Just to give you an idea, we put some of the plants back. We're still working on it. A whole bunch of plants we haven't put back yet, but there are plants where there didn't used to be. Now my research has shown over the last couple decades that if you know the number of species of moths in your local food web, moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are bad-tasting, day-flying moths. They really are. They come right out in the middle of the lineage of moths. And they can fly during the day because they don't taste very good, which means a lot of things are not eating butterflies, so they're not an important component of the local food web. But if you know the number of species of moths that are an important component of your local food web, you then have a very good index of the stability of that food web and the productivity. How many species is that food web supporting? So for the last 7 years at least, I have been taking pictures of every species of moth I could find on our property. And I'm still at it. but I'm up to 1,288 species that have come to our house because we put the plants back. And, well, let's see, got 10 acres. Pennsylvania's, what, 22.9 million acres, something like that. So in one tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of Pennsylvania, we've got 48% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And so many of these are types of bird food that we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. World Wildlife Fund said that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. I love how they say vanished, as if it's by magic. We have killed 2/3 of the wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn headlines like this around. But will it work on smaller properties, let's say in suburbia? That's an excellent question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. When they moved into their yard, it was choked with Almar honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, another serious invasive. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants. They put in a water feature that they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count all the birds that are using their yard. And they are now up to 154 bird species, including 35 warbler species, an incredible number. Just to compare that to our house, we've updated this. We've only recorded 18 species of warblers at our house, which I thought was pretty good. But on a much smaller property, they're beating us by far. So can it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. Her property abuts O'Hare Airport. 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She is not connected to any natural area at all, so she is a tiny island in the middle of Chicago. It's a pretty island, because Pam is a native plant landscaper, and she knows what she's doing. So remember this picture next time somebody says you cannot make a pretty landscape with native plants. Yes, you can. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature, and then she sat back, and she says, with a glass of wine. And I actually think it was more than one glass. And she's still at it. She's up to 127 species of birds that have used her little 1/10 of an acre, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen the woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we want to succeed in a big way. And one of those things is we got to think about those big lawns. We've got more than 44 million acres of lawn. They keep updating this, and unfortunately it keeps going up nationwide. That's an area bigger than New England dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Well, we like neat. It's a status symbol. And we have to display our Halloween decorations. And our Christmas decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? So notice I'm not saying get rid of your lawn, I'm saying reduce the area by half. Let's take spaces that look like this and turn them into this. Now this is an early planning. I got this picture from Dan Getman in Missouri. I've never met Dan, but he had that big lawn. He said, look, I'm putting the plants back, and he sent me that picture. Okay, good for Dan. Let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to cut that in half. That gives us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home, which is an area big enough to create what I'm calling homegrown national park. And it will be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put a park at home? You get the opportunity to interact with nature at your own time, your own pace. All you have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out your window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, last year 375 million people there with you, so I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free, there's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic or government closure comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. And I think the alone part is really important. You're going to develop a unique relationship, just you and Mother Nature, however you sculpture it. And it's particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour to a natural area. And they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. And they get back on the bus, and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and interact with it at their own pace, their own time, become friends with it, get to know it, fall in love with it. Alone. No parental supervision. When we hover over our kids, we are sending the message that this is scary stuff. This is really dangerous. You are not capable of doing this yourself. It's a terrible message to be sending to the future stewards of the planet. If they're afraid to be a steward, and believe me, they are. Our kids are terrified to go outside because something will happen to them. If they don't love being a steward, they're going to be a lousy steward. We can't afford any more lousy stewardship. Maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a piece of lawn with a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe very seriously how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so that the lizard can't see you coming. Then you crawl slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, and you learn how to take care of that lizard. You learn how to be a good steward of that part of the natural world. And you fall in love with that part of the natural world. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not too long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember these interactions with nature the rest of her life, and I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of them. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can. It's a real thing now, a small nonprofit. You go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the map. What that means is you put your position, your location on the map, and then the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of. It's kind of like a pledge. Maybe you really are going to reduce the lawn. You don't have to have already done it, but maybe you're going to do it over the next 10 years. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Doesn't matter how small it is. Then you put that area in the database, and your piece of your county will light up with a firefly. And you get to see how many other people have joined Homegrown National Park in your county. And the object is to get the message that everybody, whether you love nature or not, everybody is responsible for good earth stewardship. We want that message to go viral, and we want the whole country to light up. And Canada's now playing this game too. What's our mission? It's to motivate millions of people to regenerate biodiversity in the two ways that we'll do it. By planting the native plants that support it, by removing the non-native plants that do not support it, and in so doing, building a culture that's sympathetic to the needs of conservation. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and a significant increase in biodiversity is one of them. And I'm just looking at what's happened at our house. It really works. Nature is resilient. You put those plants back, nature will come. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody got rid of the invasive species just on their property, we'd be 78% done. We'd be 85% done in the East. It's not entirely done, but that is an awfully good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. We're going to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. It's the plants that do that. Lawn, by the way, is the very worst plant for sequestering carbon. Having 44 million acres of it is not the way to do that. And we're going to start to build viable habitats outside of parks and preserves. Every bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. There are equally important sociological products here, and one is national awareness. Not just of what the problem is, but what the solutions are and what everybody's role in those solutions are. We want to change the culture We want people to realize that nature's not there just for our entertainment. It's not optional. It's essential for everybody, and that means everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge existing existing conservation organizations like Audubon and National Wildlife Federation and Wild Ones and Sierra Club and all of the land conservancies. Want to get all of that great conservation that they're doing on private property recorded on the biodiversity map. So we have a very good measure, a quantitative measure of how we're doing, particularly towards the 30 by 30 initiative. I'm going to save 30% of the country by 2030. That will not happen if we don't count conservation that's happening on private property. It'll also reveal gaps where we need to work a little bit harder. Did I mention that it's free? We don't want to pull membership away from any other organization. We just want the people in these other organizations to record what they're doing on our map. It's this is a grassroots movement. So we want you to join the movement. It doesn't matter about joining the organization. You're joining the movement to make it happen. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the areas that were once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. So think of the keystone plants as when I say making most of the food, I'm talking about those caterpillars. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that's out there. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They are essential. They're the support system. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. Again, the very best keystone plant around the country is one of our oaks. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars. Tulip trees, by the way, very good trees, but they only support 21. So there's a huge difference among our native plants. We want to focus on those keystones. Over 950 species of caterpillars nationwide. How do you know what the best plants are where you live? You go to the Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. Because this changes as you move around the country. So the old excuse of not knowing what to plant is now just an excuse. You go to Native Plant Finder and you do know what to plant. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to plant keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. Turns out light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines around the country. These are all the ways that lights are killing our insects every single night. But to me, this is good news. This is good news because we have got to stop insect declines. In 2014, the estimate was that we had lost 45% of the insects on the planet. The latest estimate I just saw was that we've lost 75% of the little things that run the world. We've got to stop that and turn it around, and if we can do that by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick, but there's a lot of us to flick those switches. But right away I'm going to hear, well, I can't turn the light out over my barn, or over my front porch, or over my garage, because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you realize is the bad man doesn't come very often. Even easier is take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars as well. So we're going to shrink the lawn, we're going to use keystone plants, we're going to modify our light systems, then we're going to invite one of the mosquito foggers to come kill all of our insects. Booming business around the country. And they say it's okay, because what we're fogging is a natural organic product. And they are correct. It's pyrethroids, made by plants. It is natural and organic, just like cyanide, just like ricin, just like nicotine. There's a lot of natural organic products that are not so warm and fuzzy as they sound. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. And that's just plain false advertising. It kills all the insects that it comes in contact with, including our beloved monarch. This is the result of a mosquito fogging event on Kent Island in the Chesapeake a few years ago. My friend happened to be there. He picked up a handful of dead monarchs, but he said there were thousands on the ground. It was during a big migration. It's killing our pollinators. The interesting thing, the ironic thing is, it is not controlling our mosquitoes, which is why they have to keep coming back and back and back and killing the monarch over and over and over again. It's very hard to control mosquitoes, practically impossible to control them in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. These guys kill between 10 and 50%. So they're not even close to actually controlling the population. If you really do want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage with biocontrol. You get a bucket, and you fill it full of water, you put in a handful of straw or hay or maybe some dead leaves, organic matter. Put it out in the sun, and it builds up populations of diatoms and algae, and that is what mosquito larvae eat. So that becomes an irresistible brew to any female mosquito in your yard. She will preferentially lay her eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. That's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. $12 for a season's worth of control. It's targeted, it's cheap, you're not killing anything else. And if everybody did it, it really would work. And you know what? This works too. Get a fan, put it on your picnic table. Sit in the directed breeze while you're having your afternoon cocktail, and the mosquitoes do not fly into the directed breeze. You don't have to kill anything. All right, the fourth thing that we need to do is to landscape under our trees in a way that allows those caterpillars in the trees to complete their development. Now, this is just an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish that was true for all of the caterpillars up there, but it's not. Most of them, about 94% of them, finish growing on the leaves and then they drop from the tree and they wiggle their way underneath the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the trees. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the trees. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the area under our trees so that, particularly in the summertime, it is rock hard. Very difficult for those caterpillars to get underground to safety. So this becomes an ecological trap. These are oaks, calls moths in to lay their eggs on the leaves. The caterpillars grow, drop down, and die. And I'm convinced that this is another major cause of insect decline around the country, and the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You got a tree in a yard. I've got a grad student, Emma Jonas, now, who is measuring how well caterpillars do in a situation like that, but I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this. This is soft landing. The caterpillars fall out of the tree. The ground is not compacted there. That turns out to be a major feature. Nobody's going to walk on them. Nobody's going to ride their mower over them. Much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put big beds under your trees. The bigger, the better. If you have 3 trees in your yard and you put a bed out to the drip line in a typical yard, that will reduce the lawn by 30%. It's a very good first start without actually digging up any lawn. You can use the great variety of ground covers that we have in this area, things like wild ginger, that's native Pachysandra. There's the Virginia creeper I talked about as a ground cover. Golden seal, May-apples, foam flower, ferns. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants. Green mulch is the way to go. Your trees will love it, and so will those caterpillars. Former grad student Desiree Narango did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her study suggests that there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices, and compromise is a good thing. She had one simple question. How well do chickadee populations do in suburban landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus suburban landscapes that are dominated by typical non-native ornamentals? And when they're dominated by non-native ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars than the native landscapes. So right away, you've reduced bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Everybody had a nest box up in their yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here, we're not even going to try to breed. If they did lay eggs, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from 0 to 100%, this is what you get. We looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. The dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. And if you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you have more babies than adults die, anything above that line there, you have a growing population. But if you have fewer babies than adults die, and that's what you get below the line over here when you have a lot of non-native plants, then you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines intersect, liberally speaking, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive plants because they're ecological tumors that just keep growing and spreading and spreading. But there's a lot of ornamental plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? That's a ginkgo tree. Why does Dan have a ginkgo tree in his native planting? Well, it turns out that Dan's wife likes ginkgo trees, and Dan likes his wife. The question is that tree destroying the ecological function of that landscape? No, it's just there. It's not contributing, but it's not really taking a little space, but it's just there. Is it going to escape and become a major invasive species? No, they don't move around at all. So I like to think of plants that are just there, as if they're statues. So there you go, there's Dan's statue. If all of Dan's plants were statues, he would not have a functional landscape. So it's not the presence of these non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those really productive native plants. If we increase the percentage of them, we can tolerate a lot of non-natives. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken by a drone 400 feet up. You do not get more formal than that, and every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. If fancy Europeans can like our native plants, maybe we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor that this is not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big, could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media will tell you you need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument, it's a weak argument. We need pollinators, and we need pollinators everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere, because they're pollinating 80% of those plants and 90% of those flowering plants. How about this? A Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life here versus the amount of life here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's been doing it for several years now. It's got a cost-sharing program where the state pays homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Similar program exists in Pennsylvania now. Bit of a waiting list, but it exists. Virginia's starting one, so this is starting to catch on. There's an island off of Florida, I think it's Marco Island, that is paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to be a good steward of it, rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on invasive ornamentals like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did, Fayetteville, Arkansas, North Carolina. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water-efficient native plants. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in the far west, particularly California, it's going up now. You get $3 rebate for every square foot of lawn you replace with a xeric planting. And if you want more information on all of those programs, memorize that. All right, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one's getting more and more serious. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like nature. We like to go bird watching. We like to commune. We just like to take a walk. But it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife, so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. They're beautiful places. We want to save them so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining. But it is far more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. Again, it's not optional. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about that, but if we restrict conservation just to the areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small, too isolated, and there's too few of them. David Quammen has a great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth without ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture, and even including our gas pipelines. They all have ecological significance. So we got to put the plants back, folks. We've got to glue our rug back together again. Not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats in all those places where we've destroyed them. The good news is this is starting to happen. It really is starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans really have coexisted with the natural world. Third misstep is to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few ecologists, a few conservation biologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet, but I don't know why. Since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You are not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good earth stewardship. That does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people are getting it. They recognize the planet has some serious issues, but they all feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can modify their lights, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can get rid of their invasives, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can use keystone plants, one person can totally revitalize the little ecosystem on their property and then enhance their greater local ecosystem instead of degrading it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think of the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious that's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve, help a campus. They're all underfunded, they're all understaffed, they will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the responsibility. We certainly have the power to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own. I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thank you. And there are those websites we talked about. I know that's a long talk, so if you have to leave, you have to leave. But if you have questions, I'd be happy to entertain them as long as you want. Yes?
Is there a particular native oak that you would recommend as fiber?
Is there a particular native oak I would recommend? You know, all the oaks, particularly in this area, are very similar in their ability to support wildlife. But we do have some serious oak diseases out there. We've got bacterial leaf scourge, which is hitting the red oak group pretty hard. So at this point, I would focus on the white oak group. So white oak, post oak, chestnut oak, just to avoid disease resistant or disease susceptibility. Yes?
As somebody that's been trying to get natives, find natives, it's been challenging in this area, but I've also, and I think you wrote some papers and some research on cultivars, and whether cultivars and true native, if the impact is the same or not. Can you speak a little bit about that, please?
Right, well, two things. Yeah, the demand for native plants exceeds the supply, so it can be a little challenging right now, but that's also a business opportunity, so more and more people are starting to stock them. But when you go to the nursery, you typically find a cultivar of a native plant. Is that as good as the straight species? And the answer is, it depends on what the genetic change was that created the cultivar. We did do a study that looked at 6 traits. The only one that reduced, this was of woody plants, the only one that reduced insect use was turning a red leaf and a green leaf into a red or purple leaf. So that consistently essentially turned a productive native plant into one that's not so productive. So I would say avoid red leaf cultivars. I don't know why we like them anyway. They're ugly. But the other ones, taking a tall plant, making it short, introducing disease resistance, enhancing fall color, enhancing berry size, those actually had no impact at all on the insects. Flowers, not quite as good news there. When you change a flower size or shape, you're impacting the relationship between that flower and the specialist bees that depend on that flower. Generalists are pretty good at handling it, but the specialists have a very tight relationship. The mouth parts fit exactly the length of the corollas, and the nutrition of the pollen and nectar is exactly what they need. So when we change that stuff, it impacts those relationships. But sometimes, I mean, there are examples where a cultivar has actually increased the pollen and nectar availability. So you can't say, you know, they're all bad, they're all good. It does depend. I will direct you to Mount Cuba Center's website in Hocassin, Delaware. They've been doing a lot of trials with native and cultivars, and posting the results on their website. So there's a lot of information up there now that didn't used to exist. And then you could say, well, is this particular cultivar, have they looked at it, and what are the results? Yes?
What was it was back a ways, not real far, and you talked about the national wildlife, something that I didn't catch all of that.
Native Plant Finder.
Oh, so it's just the native plant finder, that's...
It's on the National Wildlife Federation website.
Oh, okay.
But if you put in Native Plant Finder, it will pop. Oh, and there it is.
I didn't know if that was the same.
That's it, right up there. Anything else? Yes?
No. Is there a problem with the city's weed ordinance if you wanted to have your front yard more natural?
Is there a problem with maybe your HOA, your civic ordinances? There can be, which is why we have to be strategic about this. There is the urban legend out there that if we use native plants, it's going to reduce property values. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. I can reduce property values with a really messy, totally non-native plant collection as well. So it's whether or not we're maintaining it that's going to reduce property values. This is where you can use that lawn that you keep as a cue for care. You keep a strip of lawn next to your sidewalk or next to your driveway, surrounding those new beds you put in your yard so you can actually walk through your yard. And you keep it mowed. You keep the lawn that you have manicured. That's the cue for care that they want. They don't care how many plants are in your yard as long as it meets that standard of a mowed lawn. So you can do it, and they won't even know that you added more plants. They don't know a native plant from a non-native plant, so you're safe there. But, by the way, a couple in Maryland sued their HOA It was a headline in the New York Times several months ago saying, "I fought the lawn and the lawn lost." So there's now, and they won. They won. So there's a legal precedence now for actually thumbing your nose at your HOA. But, you know, then we get into conflict. It's much better to do it in a tasteful way where they don't mind. Anything else? Yes?
How would I be able to persuade a landlord, perhaps? What are the resources that I could be like, hey?
How do you persuade a landlord? You persuade him it will not cost him anything, that you'll do it, and that he doesn't have to worry about it. It's going to enhance his property value. That's your language right there. Yes?
Sorry, another question. The deer, we have obviously the deer population is an issue, and using deer deterrents, does that also impact the pollinators, the caterpillars, other insects?
Yeah, good question. Using the sprays, the rotten eggs, and all the other things we try to keep the deer away, does it keep the insects away? There's actually a student this summer testing that. Nobody's ever tested that. My prediction is yes, because insects find their host plants by smell. If you change the smell, they're not going to recognize it as a host plant. They don't usually lay eggs on rotten eggs. So, but we have to test it to find out, but that's my prediction. So, yeah. Yes?
Is this message getting to the commercial landscapers, and if not, how can it?
You know who hires the commercial landscapers? We do. So now there's not enough commercial landscapers who have the training to do this well. And the people who do typically don't advertise because they have far more business than they can handle. So it's kind of a vacant niche. If you're looking for a good career, point you in this direction, because every place I go, people want to hire somebody who knows how to do this. And I would say, 1 week of training could give you everything you need. But there's not enough of those people to go around. If you hire the typical landscaper, you can make it very clear. I mean, then, if they don't have the knowledge, you have to have the knowledge and direct them to what you want to do. But don't let them talk you out of this. They work very hard to use the favorite plants that they have in stock and saves them a lot of money. But just be persistent. This is what I want. So how do we get the message in? I think they're getting the message, but there's a training period. I've talked to a lot of trade shows, and a lot of young people excited about it. The older folks, they don't trust that you guys are actually going to follow through. So we'll have to show them. Yes?
So I love insects on the outside of my house, but I don't necessarily enjoy them when they pass the barrier to go inside of my house.
We need to work on your attitude.
In my basement, I will do my laundry around them, but something about that first floor gets me. So how do I encourage them on the outside but not have to call the bug guy on the inside?
This is where your spider removal kit comes in. It's a jar. You put it up against the wall, shake it, they fall in, and you put them outside.
They don't come in a timely manner. Usually it's in the evening.
Yeah, I know. Insects are really good at getting inside. Every time you open the door, they could get in. You could live in a hermetically sealed house, and then you have no air exchange. I think it's just one of those things you're going to have to work through. Yes? Okay, good question. Gypsy moth, which is now the spongy moth, is an invasive species. It's from Europe. When I say we need native insects, we need native insects. Anything from the outside does not come with its suite of natural enemies, and it goes crazy. So that's true for the hemlock woolly adelgid, the emerald ash borer, the spongy moth. There's a lot of problems we have brought in by bringing in non-native insects. So, yeah, I'm talking about the natives. We don't want to tolerate the non-natives. It's just a huge, huge problem. Somebody's going to ask me, well, what do you do about the spongy moth? They're cyclic, so they have outbreak years, and it usually follows 2 or 3 years of very dry weather in the spring. That encourages their survival. When we have a cool, wet spring, there's a fungus that's made its way over, nobody knows how, that is species specific, and it actually controls gypsy moth populations really well. But it has to be cool and wet for that fungus to work. When it's dry, it doesn't work. So if you have a 2 or 3 years of bad outbreak, the question is, do you treat your oaks or not? And then it's a case-by-case scenario. If your oaks are on shallow, rocky soil, and they've been defoliated once or twice, 3 defoliations in a row can kill the tree, and you don't want to lose the oak. So then a tree-by-tree spray of probably BTs, Bacillus thuringiensis, another formulation that kills caterpillars, is the way to go. But it will kill all the caterpillars, which just rendered that tree totally useless to any migrating bird or any reproducing bird. But of course, if it's defoliated, it's not making any caterpillars anyway. So you have to weigh the pluses and the minuses, and you don't want that tree to die. Spraying by plane, you want to be very careful before you do that, because especially when you do it preventively, you're predicting it's going to be bad because of the number of egg masses. But remember, if the fungus breaks out, it controls it. So it's, you have to be careful of making the decisions. But keep in mind, when you spray your trees, it does kill all of the caterpillars, which are crucial to bird reproduction. Yes?
Would an increased bird population eat the spongy moth caterpillar?
No.
How do we know? No? Okay.
Birds don't like hairy caterpillars. That goes for fall webworm, it goes for tent caterpillar. The only 2 birds that eat hairy caterpillars are the yellow-billed and black-billed cuckoo, because they can throw up the lining of their esophagus and stomach that gets rid of all the hairs that they've just eaten, and then they can eat some more. The other birds tend to avoid them. So it's not that our native birds say, oh, I don't like a caterpillar from Europe. It's that they don't like the hairs. So it just so happens that we brought over a hairy one. Yes?
It sounds like in restoring your personal property, you've seen like a tremendous comeback for a lot of species. Do you have any sense of amphibians? How much it's helping the amphibians in your area?
Yes, I do, actually. This year, we got the wood frog that colonized a pond I dug 20 years ago. So, now it's the wood frog. It likes woods, and their trees are finally big enough that it's happy there. We found the 4-toed salamander there. A couple other salamander species in little stream that now runs full time. It used to dry up. Are there? We've got American toad. We've got the gray tree frog moved in about 10 years ago. Big population of those. I don't know what else I'm forgetting, but yes, they like it too. Because of course they all eat insects. Yeah. I think we're done. Thanks very much, everybody.